So, welcome everyone to a new edition of DCD Discover Dialogues. We are delighted today to be talking about our latest book and our first co-publishing project with Nova Dance called We Will Remember This, Nova Bhattacharya's Svāhā. In the chat, I have put two links, one to the ebook and one to the hard copy paperback version of the book, um, so that you can purchase it. It makes a great gift if you're in the gift giving season. So our guests today are Nova Bhattacharya and Brannavy Jeyasundaram. And I have been working very closely with them over the last, I don't know, year or more on this project to get this book made. Many of you may know Nova as the artistic director of Nova Dance, and also as a tremendous advocate in our community. Centering the margins is one of my favorite quotes from Nova. And then Brannavy Jeyasundaram is an interpretive planner at the Royal Ontario Museum, but she is also a writer, having published in many different journals and magazines. And she's former co-executive director of the Toronto Ward Museum. And she is the writer and curator of this publication. So they are both here to talk with us today, and we are delighted. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge where we are and where Dance Collection Dance and Nova Dance both work. This land is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It has been a site of human activity, including dance, for tens of thousands of years, and we are very grateful to all the caretakers, both recorded and unrecorded, who have looked after this land and, of course, all of Turtle Island. Today, the meeting place of Tkaronto is home to many Indigenous people from different nations from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and dance and live on this territory in this community. So I guess, Nova, we'll start with you by just asking you what Svāhā was originally. What was the original conception, and then how did that change when the pandemic hit?
The original conception was very much about volume and just this idea that I had had in my mind for a long time about working with the textures and the architecture that was possible when there are multiple bodies in the space. And also it was a declarative statement about practitioners who I felt were very much in the margins and should be taking the main stage in a big way. There had also, I can't even remember, it was like 2017 or 18 perhaps, there had been this project that a bunch of Bharatanatyam dancers in Scarborough had done, where there were 1,000 of them in a football field all doing the same choreography. And I was just like, this volume needs to be on stage. And that, yeah, so that was how it started. And the idea was that I was going to have like a core company of about 15 dancers who were going to form the nucleus of the work. And then there was going to be these 60 other dancers. And it was going to be a body choir, and we were going to be at Meridian Hall in Toronto. So there were just going to be these huge architectural chunks of dancers moving shapes and space and live music, and it was big. It was spectacular. It was big.
Right. Before in the before times. Right. And now for that big conception, was Brannavy, or maybe Brannavy, you can speak to how you were originally a part of the project.
Yeah, I remember Nova telling me about Svāhā, I think during the spring of 2017 at a restaurant that no longer exists. And the idea was to develop writing around the work while also participating in it. So we spoke about me joining the body choir as someone who has training in Bharatanatyam and would be able to would be able to participate, because I believe Nova originally, it was like the mass was conceived to be Bharatanatyam dancers for the most part, and then of course that evolved. So it was really exciting to be able to dance and write simultaneously and merge two things that I care about so deeply. But yeah, the pandemic happened and a drastic re-envisioning unfolded.
Yeah. So Nova, can you speak to that then? Then how 2020 hit, pandemic hit. Tell us what happened.
I'm even going to pull back a little bit in terms of, originally, yes, it was conceived of as being Bharatanatyam dancers. And I was kind of thinking of it as like, this was going to be my big Bharatanatyam statement that I'd never made, because that was not the way I had been working in my practice. And then in 2018, we did, Nova Dance did our Deep End weekend, and Zab Mabungo was one of the invited choreographers. And in her participant group, she had dancers who were Bharatanatyam and Kathak and Odissi, and actors and contemporary trained dancers. And she brought her practice of Lokito to that room and created something with this disparate group of performers. And it was a real reminder to me that I didn't have to limit myself to one form, and that diversity of practice that I was always working with could still be possible in what I was envisioning for this big piece. Like, I needed dancers who had facility with rhythm. I needed dancers who believed in the power of dance to tell stories and to express emotions. So as early as October of 2018, when I went into studio, I had already broken away from the Bharatanatyam only and went in with Bharatanatyam, Odissi, Kathak, I think Kuchipuri, and of course I was in the room, so Bhutto and all my practice in contemporary realms. So all of that. And then, yes, the pandemic hit, and the pandemic hit. We were supposed to do a small performance in May of 2020 with about I think it was 7 or 9 core dancers and a body choir of 14, and Brannavy was going to be part of that first body choir. And then October 2020 was the premiere date. And when the pandemic hit and we had dancers contracted, and it was one of those things of, so much about this project was also about developing the field, and also about getting certain artists who had perhaps been paralleling it or side hustling it to go, no, this is going to give you like this really meaty long-term contract in 2020, going from April all the way to October, and take your leave of absences, or take the leap. And so I couldn't just say, okay, now we're going to not do anything. And also, with everything that was going on at the time, it did feel like, okay, what is the world now? And is this how we make art? Or how are we going to make art when we can't be together? So we kept the dancers' contracts on, and we went online first for it was an 80-hour chunk that we did online between April and May, and we really tested our limits of what was possible and what could be done. And then, it's a pandemic, and Nova Dance's Canada Council operating funding came in May of 2020. There was a complete cessation of risk activity. We didn't have to pay for studio rent. So suddenly we had this tiny bit of stability, even while the world was in challenging times. So again, it enabled us to say things like, we will do these monthly creation labs, and we will be online, or dancers were learning my solos from video in a way that, the vocabulary was always intended to be in the show, but now it was just, okay, learn this solo. So those are the things that just kept the momentum going, even as all through the pandemic. I can't tell you the number of times I was on Zoom panels and, talking about, I was working on a piece that was inspired by acts of gathering, and I would just do this PTSD hysterical laugh every time I said it, because I felt like a crazy person.
Right. And so Brannavy, tell us about how your role changed when the pandemic hit.
When the pandemic hit, Nova invited me to kind of dig through the archives and write about Nova's repertoire and really understand each work within the repertoire that in some shape or form was informing Svāhā's creation through a series of conversations, which was really refreshing. So I was essentially being commissioned to, we called it the Repertoire Project, where Nova and I would discuss, certain works from way back when, and then really think through how they've evolved and what they mean to Nova as a choreographer and an artist. And it gave me this really like comprehensive, multi-dimensional understanding of the works. And the idea was that I would just create writing around the works and they would exist and we would attempt to publish them. And we did publish some of them in a few magazines, which is great. But as we were creating these works, and I will note that through the pandemic, writing became very challenging, and I just didn't have the motivation for it. I didn't feel like I could write, and even through that, to speak to like the support that artists deserve and should be able to access, I was like provided mentorship to like get through those hurdles. And anyways, what ended up happening is we had a breadth of writing that existed around Svāhā and works within Nova's repertoire. And that's when it became clear there was something meatier to what we were working on. And we sent a sporadic, I think, midnight email to you, Amy, detailing this idea for a project that we knew deserved to exist within a canon of writing about dance, specifically dance in Canada. And that's the
Mhm.
impetus. Mhm.
Yeah. And I was trying to think back to when that was. I mean, if it was early on in the pandemic or later, but I do remember that email and thinking, oh, yeah, absolutely. This
Yeah.
has to be a book. This has to. Now what like what triggered that realization for the two of you to just go, hey, we've got a book here? Or
Mm.
did you even think you had a book at first? Were you thinking of other ways of publishing it? I can't remember.
It wasn't so much that we thought about a book, but we were very definitely the writing and the documentation around this project. Like even from the beginning of the project, I would have so many people say to me, oh, this should be a movie, this should be a documentary. And I'd be like, yeah, and that's a whole other thing to fundraise for. I'm going to focus on making the dance. But the writing and also capturing the experience of multiple artists within the project was always really important, because I knew that as a choreographer, I was working towards something. And also, as I said, this project was also really about developing the field and bringing more artists into an experience of working on a project like this, on something that was going to be on stages where artists like ourselves haven't often been seen. And so it was like, so even from the very beginning contracts with the dancers, there was a clause saying that they were going to be asked to do reflective writing on it. And so yeah, so the value of writing, the value of words, the value of Brannavy's craft as a writer, all these things were very much what sort of organically led us to talk to you. And then it was like, oh, well, that means book.
um the I don't know if that prospect frightened you or excited you, but but it certainly it was a wonderful journey to make this book. Brannavy, can you talk a bit more about the mentorship and how that helped you?
Absolutely. So I remember through the repertoire project, which was the writing that Nova and I were working on in 2020 through the pandemic, we had created a contract where essentially I was responsible for writing a certain number of pieces within a specific word count. and I just was not meeting what was required of me. And, you know, in that situation, it was really refreshing to have honest conversation with Nova, expressing what was becoming challenging and being met with an opportunity to further expand and explore my own craft as a writer. Some background is I don't have a formal writing education. I've always written in diaries as a child, but I don't have a journalism degree. Writing is very like organic, and it's something that I learned through like observation and reading. So I've never received this type of mentorship that so many writers benefit from. So to be paired with Geetanjali Kolanath, who's a brilliant writer, um, a novelist, and kind of share and share my own challenges, but also being encouraged and being mandated to write. She developed this practice where we would do a free write while thinking about a specific topic, whether it's a work within Nova's repertoire or even a theme. I was deeply interested in thinking about the body as an archive of a memory and emotion, and Geetha was able to really like allow me to focus on that and write about that in an unstructured manner. And so much of that writing informed one of, I think, one of my favorite essays that I've written, and also part of the book, on mascara. And it was so nice to be able to challenge myself as a creative nonfiction writer, but also when met with an inability, which I think all artists can recognize, like when the world feels very unsettling, sometimes it's difficult to create work, but to be met with that and then also then offered like a way out through through community and reciprocity was really powerful.
Yeah. And so when gatherings started to happen again, when you could have rehearsals in person, Brannavy, were you physically going to Svāhā rehearsals and sitting in? And if so, what was that process like for you?
Yeah, I was definitely going when I remember doing my first COVID test actually ever at a Nova Dance rehearsal. And I would observe iterations of the work. And you know, there were so many dancers that were coming in and out, and some who were a part of the process and not necessarily the final production. But a part of the work was to be in the space where artists um, were making dance, because it was not necessarily about writing in the way that like critiques or reviews around art and dance works exist, but it was very process driven, because there's less writing about how art is made. So that was a huge emphasis of the work that I was asked to do.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. I just want to come back to that idea of the body archive that you brought up. And because this is this is something I think about a lot. It's a conversation I've had with many different artists over time, because that is one of the biggest challenges with archiving a physical art form like dance is the fact that our main artifact is the dance itself, and it inherently happens and disappears in the same moment. And so that embodied archive of the dances that performers learn and perform it's how do you archive that, right? I've sort of, as I work through this conundrum in my head, I think about, well, maybe I should just be resolved to the fact that we can't actually archive the body archive, that it can be transferred from body to body, but it's the one thing we can't put in a box and put on a shelf for safekeeping and just open it up later. And I'm just curious to hear what both of you think about that idea of the embodied archive and how we hang on to it for future generations.
I think for me, one of the most powerful realizations that came out of the creation of Svāhā is, especially as somebody who has never formally been a teacher of dance, the potency of transmission, of a vocabulary, of an idea, of intentions. Like Maskura, which Brannavy mentioned, is a solo that I made dedicated to Jahanara Akhlaq, this dancer who was taken from us far too soon. And now more than 22 dancers have lived inside that vocabulary. More than 22 dancers have learnt the story of Jahanara and who she was. And, you know, the ones, you know, the ones who had some sort of connection, who had ever seen her, those who haven't. And then, you know, part of the visual images dancers were being shown, you know, were pictures of her. And so now when I see, you know, all these other dancers doing this work, and the motifs coming alive, it feels like, yes, we are keeping Jahanara alive in this dance. And many other people, like in our first processes in studio again in March and April of 2022, I repeatedly had the dancers invoking either ancestors or dancers who they admired. And, you know, so all those people, all our teachers, the continuum of dance is, and, you know, and there were dancers in the company whose first steps were from their own mother or aunt or grandmother. And, you know, so the way that those layers of embodied knowledge are being evoked and enshrined and celebrated, and I think it just keeps that's the magic of dance, right? We're keeping it alive in that way. And no, we might not be able to take it off a shelf, but boy, when it happens, is it powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Brannavy?
No, just that it was exactly that. It was this idea that a work that was created around a really particular form of grief could be re-envisioned, or not even re-envisioned, but could be reinterpreted. And many diasporic dance artists don't necessarily have records of history within limited, you know, capacity of dance archiving in Canada to rely on. So to be able to lean on, like, you know, visual references to Jahanara, Nova stories, but also what other artists, dance artists, are bringing to this specific form based on their own movement traditions. It was very inspiring to see how we carry archives within ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and Nova, you of course have also been on the other end of that transmission as part of Peggy Baker's Choreographers Trust project, where she passed Sanctum on to you. So did, like, thinking back to that process, which was like 20 years ago, did that inform you at all when you were passing on Maskura?
Absolutely. I mean, some in very pragmatic ways. I think the contract is basically the exact same contract I signed with Peggy. We just flipped it around. And yes, like once it became clear that all these dancers were actually learning it as a solo, we did license it to all of them. So they all have it in their repertoire now. And that idea that the bodies of work that are being created have a value beyond the person who first created it and performed it. And also it's gone in so many directions now with the information that all the different artists are bringing to it, and also just to be able to really, you know, yes, Nova Dance has existed since 2008, but, you know, I was an independent, then the company, you know, started as a soloist endeavor. And the fact that to have the opportunity to look back on a body of work that was created and integrate it into the present in a moment where there is more space being opened up for a multiplicity of dance expressions is exciting for the field, but just also personally, individually, was the pandemic really allowed for a lot of reflection and introspection, and also analysis and understanding of things. And the first movie I went to see post-pandemic was The Talking Heads and Stop Making Sense. And this concert movie where they construct the concert, and David Byrne is dancing, and then they pull it all apart again. And I was just sitting there going, yeah, that's what I do. So yeah, like, it's to be able to look back and reflect and see those things, to put value on things that were created in one context and allow them to evolve and expand, are definitely things that, having participated in Choreographers Trust and also being a student of Bharatanatyam, like there's a solo of Menika's that I know the solo version, but Nina and other dancers always did the ensemble version. So there's things like that as well that have always informed the way I work with creation.
Right. Yeah. Great. So Brannavy, I want to sort of change tracks here and talk to you more about process of curating this book. Because it had different iterations. We had this Google Doc that was sort of laid out what the plan was, and it evolved over time. So take us through a bit of that thought process, and what made you go in the route that you ended up going, and how you curated the other parts, as in, so people should know that the book includes many different contributions from artists from the project as well.
Yes, yeah, the book is by, it almost feels like an anthology, really, of writing from dance artists, dance admirers, appreciators, in Toronto, where there's writing that I've contributed to it as well as part of a whole, including, writing from Nova. But the curation process definitely, it ended up mirroring Nova's choreographic process in many ways. The book, what felt really interesting was that there were works within the Nova Dance repertoire that were being reinterpreted, but also shared between various dance artists that were coming into the company at the time, whether or not they would participate in Svāhā. And there was something about, the relinquishing of power there, but also pulling up the past and movement vocabularies of specific works to then create an ensemble work that felt special. So originally the book was divided into specific chapters, where each chapter would focus on a specific piece within the Nova Dance repertoire, and then there would be writing that focused on the past, or how that piece maybe originally was conceived, how it's presently being conceived, and its intention for the future. And then as we evolved, it didn't feel like that delineation of time was as concrete as we originally, or I curated it to be. It felt like what was happening in the present with a work like Mascara, for example, to isolate it from the past in a separate work of writing didn't feel as organic. So we moved away from a work that was so focused on pieces within repertoire, and instead more on processes of collaborating with artists, Nova Dance, ethos and philosophies and techniques, the creation of Svāhā, of course, but also how artists from all, disciplines, and I can't remember the exact number of forms that are captured in Svāhā, but predominantly diasporic dance artists who are creating and have learned dance forms that aren't a part of the dominant arts landscape in Canada, how they're participating and how they're what their experience has been like, because there isn't a lot of written record about that. So it became more so around Nova Dance as a company, specific works within Nova Dance that were iconic to the formation of Svāhā, as well as the intentions for dance artists in the future. And the pandemic was the undercurrent throughout the writing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite fascinating to like be on the outside and watching this process happen, and watching, because you know, I'm, as your editor, I was just you know, giving you a free hand, right? Because I think that's really important. I think an editor's role is to guide, but to give authors as much room as they need. And it was interesting to see the transition over time with how the structure of the book would be. And I think that, well, I'm very proud of what we've accomplished together. I think we've really captured an important moment in time. You know, when the pandemic first hit, I was curious about how the Spanish flu had affected dance in the past, and started digging around to try and find records of that. And there's very little, even in our archives and in different sort of newspaper archives, that kind of thing. It was hard to find exact instances about how it was, you know, affecting dance in Canada in particular. And so I kept thinking, oh, isn't it too bad that we don't have sort of a diary account, or, you know, items like that that would let us know how dancers dealt with this. Did they close their schools? Did they, you know, stop performing, that kind of thing? So I think it's really important what we've done here in capturing not just dance in the pandemic and this sort of case study of how one company dealt with that, but all of the things that were changing in our society at that moment, after George Floyd, and, you know, all kinds of, you know, just different sociological parts of our humanity that started to come to the fore, that were changing conversations. I feel like we've really captured that in this book. So I also wanted to hear from the two of you about your own writing processes, because I'm always fascinated by that. And so just wanted you to both elaborate on what your process is when you sit down and write. Or maybe you don't sit down first before you write.
I do like to write in many different positions. Lying down is one of them, but also standing, or but basically for me, and I was saying this recently in another context, that writing still feels like this emerging craft. Like, yes, of course, I've done oodles of it for grants and, you know, like every program note and all that kind of stuff. But writing for the sake of writing is still something that, well, again, the pandemic meant I was doing a lot of writing for the sake of writing. So things have been sort of percolating. And, you know, at the beginning, Amy, you said you weren't sure if I was excited or terrified, and there was definitely like, a book is intimidating, right? Because then it's in hard print, and to give yourself permission to know that it's okay, that what you said at that moment is allowed to change and digress, and just because you said it, it isn't carved in stone, and just because you said something at a certain moment in time doesn't mean that it's right and has to be true for the rest of your career. Like, things can shift. And really for me, because I was the concluding essay, it was when everything else had been kind of compiled, and then taking this, you know, terrifying dive through what other people had to say and other people's thoughts that also were somehow connected. And for me, one of the things that became really important, you know, beyond the moment in time of the pandemic, was also for the trajectory of Nova Dance to really, like, it needed to be contextualized by all the other people, whether it's the people in Toronto or the people across the country who have been working to make change and to reach for different kinds of futures for dance. So it just became really important to integrate as much of that in as possible to fill out the story. And yeah, I think for me, it's often kind of this act of, I always say, brain vomit, of just like, blah, get it out there, and then start to try and find the, I think I do the brain vomit, but also similar to my choreography, I find the structure and I find the spine and I find the big picture that I'm going to fill.
Right. Yeah. And what about you, Brannavy?
My writing process is I am trying to move, and this is something Geetha, the mentor that Nova Dance provided me with, has urged me to do, is treat writing as a practice versus pressurized, just something that I'm like moving towards a
product.
deadline on. Yeah. So the best writing I've realized that emerges is often when you're dedicating segmented times to really think through something without the pressure of like creating a neat sentence with this clause and having whatever sentence formulation. It's more so just like being able to really think through a concept or an idea that you've been interested in. So I shifted from like writing from a point of stress and starvation, really. Like I needed to make myself feel uncomfortable in order to write. To move towards writing as a practice with the self, but also in communication. And yeah, I will say we were definitely moving towards the last hour, and there was a lot of pressurized writing towards certain parts of the book, but there are also works that I've contributed that I've had the luxury of being able to really soak and are part of that practice that Geetha shared with me.
Right. Yeah, we did. Yes, there were times when your editor had to crack the whip a bit.
Got us together. Yeah.
But then that was partly because we had a set date, like in terms of marketing, it made sense to launch the book in Vancouver when Svāhā was being performed there and as part of the Indian Summer Festival. And so having those hard deadlines, well, it's like putting on a show, right? Like, so usually with book publishing, we have a little more leeway because we can choose a book launch when the book is ready. But for this, we had a performance date to connect with. So there was a little more urgency.
And I'm glad we did. Yeah, that was beautiful.
So maybe I thought how about we show this little video clip and then we can open it up to questions or other things that we want to talk about. How does that sound? Okay. So I have to say, this Svāhā was the first piece I saw in the theater again after the long COVID break. And it was the perfect piece of theater for that moment. It truly was, because it just, I mean, it has everything in it, but the joy and the theatricality of it are tremendous. I remember tearing up in one part when Nina was performing a solo that was just so stunning and so moving. It was just, it's one of those moments that you live for in the theater, right? Like, I feel like every excursion to the theater is this, it's this quest for surprise. Is it gonna rock me back to, is it gonna kick me to the back of the theater with its power, or is it just gonna sort of leave me, sort of going, oh, okay. And right, it's a chance, right? We're taking a chance every time we go to the theater about how it's going to make us feel and what we're going to see. And this was tremendous, this piece. I think I wrote you a message afterwards to tell you that. But, so congratulations on that. And are we going to get to see it again in Toronto, do you think?
I fully intend to, I keep saying this is Nova Dance's Revelations. It's going to be happening long after I'm gone. And we're so yeah, stay tuned. It will happen.
Right. Okay. So if people would like to, oh, Nina says there was no sound. Okay, I will fix that in the recording. Are there any questions from our audience members or other things Nova or Brannavy would like to chat about in this process of bookmaking?
I was happy that you said it was our first publishing project together. I would certainly like to do it again.
Yeah.
When we were doing it the first time, I joked with Amy. I was like, can we call it a book in progress? Do we have to commit? Can we? And yeah, it was really a learning experience because, I was so focused on making the show, and the book was kind of happening in the cloud behind me, and then Svāhā existed, and then it was like, oh no, it's a book about my art, so it's not a third party thing. I'm just as invested in what is going to come out at the end of it, which when you became involved as the editor. And yeah, like just all those learnings of like, what are the things that we need to do and what is the story we're trying to tell. And I also, during the pandemic, I did a live stream with Barbara Willis-Sweet and Citadel, and like thinking about things in a filmic way and then thinking about things in a bookish way were really things that stretched my creative capacities, and in ways that I found very exciting and invigorating, and would love to have the opportunity to revisit.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I would too. Brannavy, what about you? Are you going to write another book?
Oh dear. I would love to write another book. I think. I don't know if I have a specific, I mean, yeah, it was such a privilege to be able to watch a company, an artist, and create writing around their work for many years at a time that accumulated into a book. I think that's really rare and that's special, to have had that relationship with Nova and Nova Dance. I do write, for the sake, like, for my own personal pleasure these days, which I am enjoying that shift. But I don't necessarily foresee a book in the near future.
But maybe the far future.
It's quite, maybe in the far future. Yeah, but it's a huge amount of labor, and I think, of course, there's like the writers and the contributors that are able to embrace the final product. But Amy, you were such diligent and patient, and Miriam as well. Your expertise like saw us through, and there were times where we needed to drown our kittens or kill our angels or whatever, and being able to have like decisive direction and leadership through the process produced this work, which I think is it's rare. It's rare to have a collection of writing on dance through like a massive public health crisis, but not just dance, like dance process making, arts building in Toronto, reflections, like first person reflections from racialized dance artists, moving through this period of immense like shift as it relates to the art sector and social change. So I feel really proud of what we did. And I am really grateful that within this team, we're all artists, we all have distinct opinions. I know that I'm very particular around certain things, but it was just so nice to just have a creative feedback loop at all times.
Yes. Yeah, that
Yeah.
is valuable. Yeah. Good. Nina would love to hear about why writing this book was so important for the work of Svāhā itself.
I guess, again, part of that, the reflection process, like the work happened and then the book was being launched alongside the Vancouver performances. And certainly for me, when we were in Toronto for the premiere, my understudy got COVID. So I never actually got to sit in the house and watch a run of the show. I was always in and out. And but by the time we got to Vancouver, and there were some tweaks made to the show, including there was another solo put in for myself with the Sari, and which was always supposed to have been there, and I kind of don't know why in Toronto it didn't make it in, but all those kinds of things. And I think that's the point, where because the book existed, that also allowed me to look back and go, right, okay, we almost got there, and here's something else that will help really bring this work back to the essence of it. Because basically my Sari solo is where this work began. I had created a piece called Aditi in 2010, which and in 2017 or 16 I was at Ted Robinson's farm, and I showed him the video of the solo, and I said, this is the solo I want to take and make into this really big piece, and is this a sound idea? And so the fact that we were able to reintegrate that solo in for Vancouver, things like that the book just allowed, again, another moment of my own work being reflected back at me. So then you can fill in what's missing and where else it needs to go.
Right.
Okay.
And it also really underscored the fact that the ritual of gathering, which inspired the work, and then the fact that the work became a celebration of dance as a ritual of gathering, like all those things became so much more poignant and potent because the words of the dancers themselves, or because the words of Louis, like different people who were part of the journey, have now filled in so much of the connective tissue.
Yeah. Miriam, what did you want?
Well, no, when Nova just said that, it's very interesting because I didn't see the piece. I wasn't able to come. Does that book, which, by the way, both of you are exceptional writers. I said that to Brannavy at the launch, and Nova, and you're both very, very different about how you characterize situations and people. So that was very refreshing, but both very powerfully strong, good writers. Additional to that were the words from some of the dancers, which were also very good and very individual in their perceptions. So, I mean, it is a little gem, but what Nova just said made me think, could you say that book could stand on its own as a book if you weren't a dancer or invested in some way in the art form as an audience member? Here's a book, and it's in a bookstore or it's in a library, and I'm just a citizen, but I like reading about the arts. I think it could. I think it's got such good writing and emotional sort of, I don't know, meaty stuff in there, that it could stand on its own as an experience, as just a book, right? What now? Have you had feedback from people?
I just a couple of weeks ago got my first feedback from a civilian, and she basically said that she enjoyed getting this glimpse into, she said even beyond backstage, but into the studio and into the Zoom room and what was going on. And yeah, so far it seems like it can stand on its own. You don't need to be a dance nerd to appreciate it.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel the same way. And that was always in, of course, as the publisher, as the person who has to make sure the books sell, it is always making sure that you still have to produce a sellable product at the end of it. And I always felt like that you didn't have to see the choreography to understand the book. You didn't even have to be, a huge dance authority to understand the book. It's the stories that are there. It's this, it's this moment in time, and it's tracing these different artists, and all the biographical stuff about Nova is so fascinating, to know her story and her roots and everything, to where she is at this moment. And the little passages that we included about from the dancers, that they wrote about the what we call the Svāhā stories, these little moments, from rehearsals and so on. I love those little passages. They give us insight, and they sort of give us a kind of fly on the wall quality. We feel like we were there for that moment, that we get to interpret something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it absolutely can stand on its own. And what's so special about it is this like plurality and diversity of voices from like all kinds of people that are connected to dance, but ultimately like believe in art
Mhm.
within, I was gonna say Toronto, but also like beyond Toronto as well.
Yeah. And for a lot of these artists, it was their first time contributing to a book as well. And I did receive several emails from different people just saying how great it was to be a part of this process, to have, something tangible, or as Miriam Adams says, which I quote that I love, a book will outlive us all. And it's very, very true. So this beautiful hot pink number will be here long past the rest of us, which is wonderful. Well, I think on that note, we will wrap things up, but thank you both, for being a part of our dialogue today. As I said in the past, it was a pleasure to work with you on this project. You are both fantastic writers, and I look forward to doing it again in the future. And thank you everyone for joining us today, for DCD Discover Dialogues. We'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.